Russia's 20th century is not the story of a country's normal flow. It is the story of an empire arriving late in full view, a war that accelerates everything, a revolution that rewrites not only power, but even the smallest details of daily life, and, in the end, a process that forces the entire world to redraw its order. When most people tell this story, they remember a single scene: the Winter Palace, red flags, the slogan about 10 days, a fate that changes overnight. That scene is real, yet by itself it can mislead. Because 1917 is not the beginning. 1917 is the breaking point of a long tension. The breaking point is only the visible face of pressure that has been building for years. First, you have to look at the empire's rhythm. In the early 1900s, Russia is vast, but it is not a state that functions like a modern one. It sits at the same table as Europe's great powers, yet inside it is still built on a heavy, rigid, delayed structure. On one side, industrializing cities, factory workers, a rapidly growing educated class. On the other, millions tied to the land, the tempo of the village, the absolute authority of the czar, and a bureaucracy designed to protect it. In a system like that, even the word reform becomes dangerous, because reform isn't just a new law, it enlarges society's expectations. And once expectations grow, the limits of authority become visible. And when limits become visible, people begin to ask, if you can take one step, why not take two? 1905 is the first major explosion of that question. It arrives like a revolution, it is crushed like a revolution, and it leaves behind a critical trace. The state has seen society's pressure. Society has also seen that the state can step back. A Duma is created, a constitution is discussed, elections are held. But all of it is reluctant. Powers are clipped. There is a parliament, but power is still gathered at the top. Russia looks like it is walking toward a constitutional order. In reality, it advances not like a man walking forward, but like a man grabbing the wall just to avoid falling. At the same time, one more thing happens. Modern politics enters the stage. Workers organize in the cities. Land demands grow in the countryside. The educated class sees more sharply the gap between the empire's claim of being a world power and its internal backwardness. Opposition is no longer just an idea, it starts becoming a machine. Organization, newspapers, unions, parties, propaganda. One of the empire's greatest mistakes becomes clear here. It accepts change too late. A late reform is often not reform, it is shock. Because a system is forced to say maybe to things it has called never for years. And the moment you say maybe, the question why not swells. Then comes World War I. The war overturns not only Russia's army, but its entire economy and social psychology. Losses rise at the front. Transport collapses. Shortages begin in the cities. Lines grow longer. Fuel and bread stop being ordinary consumption and become survival. At this point, the word bread stops being an ideological slogan. It becomes a real measure. The legitimacy of the state is squeezed into one question: what will people feed their children tomorrow morning? The war has another effect as well. It accelerates everything. Anger that would normally accumulate over a decade explodes in 2 years. Transformations that would normally take generations are turned upside down in a few months. The war doesn't just bring poverty, it exposes the state's incompetence, injustice, and top-down blindness. That is why February 1917 arrives. The February Revolution is not a party trick that suddenly appears. With cities boiling, soldiers dissolving, supply lines collapsing, the authority at the top of the regime suddenly drops into a void. The czar is gone. A provisional government is formed. Everyone starts saying a new era. But the war does not end. And if the war does not end, nothing ends. This is the provisional government's biggest trap. It tries to reform while still inside the war. Society's most urgent demand is peace. The government cannot bring itself to leave the war. The idea of if we just endure a little longer, we'll win becomes a disaster politically, economically, psychologically, because people no longer want to hear the sentence a little longer. Right then, a dual power emerges, the street and the government. The Soviets, workers' and soldiers' councils grow stronger. In people's eyes, real power is no longer produced only by official institutions. Legitimacy begins to be measured by who speaks most clearly and forcefully about bread and peace. This is where October comes from. It is easy to narrate October as a one-night raid, but what makes October possible is the gradual swelling of three words that touch society's nerve endings long before that night: bread, peace, land. Bread because hunger is a real fire. Peace because the war is now producing not homeland but graves. Land because for the peasant, politics is as concrete as who owns the soil. In the end, what matters is who carries those three words more clearly, more harshly, and more organizationally. And here, one difference stands out: organizational discipline. At that time, Russia has not only the Bolsheviks. There are Mensheviks, socialist revolutionaries, liberals, monarchists, countless factions. There are many ideas, but an idea alone is not power. Power is speed of decision-making, coordination, not falling apart in a moment of crisis. What separates the Bolsheviks is precisely this: being a machine that does not fall apart in crisis, that can decide quickly, that can move with a centralized structure. October is one, but the real story begins now: governing. Because the hardest part of revolution is not taking the palace, it is making the country run. Civil war erupts, white armies, foreign interventions, fractured regions. You think the war has ended, the war begins anew. These years produce the harsh period called war communism, forced grain requisitions, heavy state intervention, and economy focused on survival. This is the period when sentences ideology constructs in calm times slam into the wall of reality. You can imagine running a country without markets, but if railroads don't run, if the currency system collapses, if production stops, that imagination becomes a logistical nightmare within days. Revolutionaries may be brave at overthrowing, but building is an engineering job. When the Civil War ends, another dream ends too: world revolution. In the early years, the Bolsheviks expect revolutions across Europe, Germany, Hungary, elsewhere. When it doesn't happen, the Soviets are left alone. And when you are left alone, you again realize you can't produce bread with ideology. And here comes Lenin's most critical move: the NEP. The new economic policy can be described as giving up, but it is really a maneuver: keeping state control while opening limited space for the market, reviving production, breathing room especially in agriculture, re-establishing contact with the outside world. It is a hybrid period. The NEP is also an acceptance of reality. The Soviet state cannot survive by completely cutting itself off from the international economic system. This move sparks intense debate inside the party, because revolution means principles, but it also means survival. When principles and survival collide, politics becomes a bloody struggle. As Lenin's health collapses, that struggle sharpens, and one of the most critical thresholds in Russian history opens: power after Lenin. The Trotsky-Stalin tension is not simply a clash of two personalities. It is a clash of governing models. Trotsky represents a more intellectual, more globally revolutionary line. Stalin represents the party apparatus, cadres, appointments, oversight, the bureaucratic skeleton of the revolution. What repeats in history repeats again,
In crisis, the biggest winner is not the one with the most brilliant idea, but the one who controls the machine best. Stalin rises. At first, he seems to claim Lenin's legacy. Then he quickly shifts position. He declares the NEP unsustainable, and the country enters one of the harshest breaks in Soviet history: collectivization. Collectivization is the attempt to make agriculture part of the state's great plan. On paper, it promises efficiency and industrialization. In reality, it creates enormous pressure on the peasantry. Those who resist are branded as kulaks, displaced, punished. Grain is taken by force. Great famines occur. The scale differs from region to region, but the result does not. Millions of lives are upended.
At the same time, industrialization accelerates. Factories, steel, machinery, infrastructure. The Soviet state prepares itself for the next war, because in the 1930s, Europe begins to smell a new Great War coming. And these years have a dark face too: purges. The 1937 through 38 period is known as the Great Terror. Party cadres, the army, the bureaucracy, a country's ruling class seems to tear itself apart. Those who made the revolution yesterday become traitors today. Confessions, show trials, executions. This is the harshest real-world counterpart to the metaphor that revolutions eat their children. At this point, the logic of the system changes. The revolution is no longer the core. The state is. And the state does not want opposition. It wants stability, and it builds that stability through fear. Then comes 1941, the Nazi invasion. For the Soviets, this is not an ideological debate. It is a question of existence. The country burns, cities are destroyed, millions die. But the Soviet Union survives. The Red Army retreats, regroups, attacks, and goes all the way to Berlin. Here, history produces a painful irony. Stalin's accelerated industrialization plays a critical role in winning the war. In other words, the heavy industrial capacity built at enormous human cost turns the wheels of wartime survival. This is not justification, it is the cold reality of the balance sheet. After the war, the Soviet Union becomes a victorious superpower. But for ordinary people inside, one of the hardest periods begins: post-war exhaustion. Victory arrives, but relief does not. On the contrary, the state demands one last sacrifice. The country must be rebuilt, heavy industry strengthened, the army kept powerful, an invincible fortress established. And in this period, the door to the Cold War opens. Debates about the Cold War's causes never end. Who started it? Who wanted to sustain it? Which crisis broke where? But the central fact is this: the post-war international order that was built was not an order the Soviet Union could fully integrate into. As the West built a system on its own norms, the Soviets remained outside it. The Soviets could be open to pragmatic compromises, but the rules of the system were written by the West. The Soviets wanted to be an equal player. The West often found it more functional to keep the Soviets as an external threat. The 1948 Berlin crisis, the founding of NATO in 1949, then the hardening of the Soviet bloc. The 1950s and 60s are the years when mutual misreading becomes a system. There is another face to these years as well: the social dimension of modernization. In a relatively short period, the Soviet Union undergoes a massive transformation. Urbanization rises, literacy increases, women's participation in the workforce grows, scientific and technical capacity expands. Sputnik's launch in 1957 is not only a technological achievement, it is a declaration: we can do it too. That is why reading the Soviet story only through repression is incomplete. Reading it only through development is also incomplete. Both move at the same time. On one side, modernization; on the other, fear. On one side, education; on the other, exile. On one side, science; on the other, censorship. When the 60s and 70s arrive, the system hits a different problem: fatigue and stagnation. The revolution created a rhythm built on permanent crisis and mobilization, but a society cannot live in mobilization forever. The ruling class avoids risk, the bureaucracy swells, the economy grows but efficiency falls. The technological race begins to slip. People want to live better, the system wants more control. And then 1979, Afghanistan. This war strains Soviet limits, militarily, economically, psychologically. A swamp outside, a growing hopelessness inside. These years make the cracks in the system visible. In the mid-1980s, Gorbachev arrives, Perestroika and Glasnost. This is not meant to destroy the system, it is meant to save it. But a late reform is often not reform, it is loss of control. When transparency arrives, realities suppressed for years surface all at once. When you try to transform the economy, you are forced to loosen politics as well. And when politics loosens, the centralized structure that works like an imperial system begins to dissolve. The nationalities question returns. Republics want their own path. The center can no longer sustain its old power. In 1991, the Soviet Union collapses.
The world order suddenly looks unpolar. Russia falls from superpower status into economic and social trauma. The 1990s are harsh years, showing how a country can fracture while undergoing system change. Privatizations, oligarchs, impoverishment, institutional collapse, and identity crisis. And then you return to the beginning. Russia's 20th century is not the victory or defeat of a single ideology. It is one of the harshest tunnels a country enters to escape backwardness. On one side stands this fact: a society that is largely rural in the 1920s with low levels of urbanization. By the 1980s, a largely urban country with rising education levels and a massive industrial infrastructure. This transformation is not accidental. It is achieved through state coercion, planning, mobilization, and sometimes cruelty. On the other side stands this fact: the cost of that transformation is carved into millions of lives. Famine, exile, fear, purges, war, repression. This cost is not a footnote, it is the main sentence of the story. That is why the most honest sentence about the Soviet experiment is often uncomfortable. It both succeeded and destroyed at the same time. And telling this story only with chronology often isn't enough, because chronology does not carry a human voice. At this point, another method of narration comes into play: the eye of literature. Methods used by works like Kızıl Yıldız, newly published studies that approach the era through lived language, lean on exactly this: carrying a period not only through leaders' decisions, but through the words of people who lived it. Feeling the violence of the Civil War through a witness's sentence, the suffocating atmosphere of the 1930s through a novel's darkness, the exhaustion of the war through a poem's silence. Because the Soviet Union is as much a life as it is a state, and life cannot be told through charts, it is told through scenes. Imagine a scene: winter 1917. Cities are cold, lines are long, people look at bread, not at the government. Imagine a scene: a station on a rail line during the Civil War. 3 days ago, a different flag hung there. Now, another flag. People aren't even calculating which flag they belong to, but which flag will bring food. Imagine a scene: 1937. When a man hears a knock at night, he prays it is the wrong apartment. Imagine a scene: 1942. A city under siege. In the dark, people look at each other and ask, "Are you alive?" Imagine a scene: 1957. A child hears Sputnik on the radio. The poverty at home does not change, but the sky suddenly becomes ours too. Imagine a scene: 1989. People have learned the language of fear, but they don't know what to replace it with. Russia's 20th century is the stacking of these scenes on top of one another. And that is why you have to return, at the end, to the central question: what does this story tell? First, empires do not forgive delay. A reform postponed invites revolution. Second, war is history's accelerator. Processes that would move slowly in normal times run in wartime. Third, revolution is not only an idea, it is organization. An idea alone cannot build power. Fourth, modernization is sometimes told like a development fairy tale, but it is often a story of cost. Fifth, when a system reforms to save itself, if it is too late, reform may not save it, it may dissolve it. Russia's 20th century is a century that carries all 5 truths at once. An empire collapses, a revolution takes power, a civil war burns the country, a modernization drive transforms the country, a period of terror silences the country, a world war makes the country a superpower, a Cold War both enlarges and consumes it, and in the end, an attempt at reform produces one of the largest closures by dissolving a massive structure. This story is not told to produce a single truth, but to see this. History sometimes chooses a country and turns it into a laboratory. In the 20th century, Russia was that laboratory.
Thank you so much for watching. If you like this video, feel free to share, like, and subscribe.